Caffeine Withdrawal. How to Get Away from Caffeine Addiction. By Richard Aurel. Introduction. Caffeine is the most commonly consumed psychostimulant in the world. Its widespread use is related in part to its desirable acute effects and the desire to avoid its adverse withdrawal. Symptoms, which may develop following cessation of regular consumption. Numerous physiological, behavioral and subjective acute effects of caffeine and caffeine withdrawal have been characterized. However, the biological basis of these acute effects and withdrawal symptoms remains poorly understood. The specific neuronal or endocrine systems that underlie each acute effect or withdrawal symptom of caffeine have yet to be identified. The extent to which these systems mediate caffeine's acute effects and withdrawal symptoms is unknown. Whether the acute effects and withdrawal symptoms of caffeine occur independently of one another or in clusters representative of common underlying mechanisms also remains unknown. The type and severity of caffeine's acute effects and withdrawal symptoms vary between individuals. This diversity has been explained partly by different lifestyle, environmental, health-related and physiological factors. Since it has been considered to be the most widely used psychoactive drug, it is found in many foods and beverages, such as coffee, tea, soft drinks, energy drinks, chocolate, as well as in many analgesics. 87% of the world populations consume caffeine with an average intake of 193 mg per day, which ranges between 166 mg and 336 mg among adults ages 18 to 65. Using standardized caffeine content values of 135 mg per 8 ounces coffee, 50 mg per 8 ounces black tea, and 35 to 55 mg per 12 ounces soft drink, Center for Science in the Public Interest website, www.spinet.org, published online July 1997, the average intake approximately corresponds to either 12 ounces of coffee, 1% liters of soft drinks, or 4 cups of tea. The high incidence of caffeine use is significant because caffeine has both acute and chronic effects on a wide range of health concerns, such as blood pressure, bone loss, pregnancy, cerebral blood flow, sleep, vigilance, cognitive performance, reaction time, and mood. This normal state is a naturalistic observation of real-world caffeine use, but can caffeine use be accurately quantified and validated when the caffeine content of beverages and individuals' consumption varies from day to day? More importantly, in contrast to the widespread belief that caffeine is a stimulant that improves alertness, some investigators believe that daily habitual caffeine use is maintained by the reversal of withdrawal symptoms. Hypothetically, caffeine primarily has a stimulant effect following overnight withdrawal, but this has not been directly compared to its effects following normal caffeine use. For daily caffeine users, can caffeine stimulate mood and performance beyond the normal baseline, or does greater consumption merely lead to greater physical dependence and more severe withdrawal symptoms? Physical and chemical properties of caffeine. 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine is the systematic name for caffeine. Pure caffeine can be obtained through a number of methods including decaffeination of coffee, black tea and green tea, methylation of other methylxanthines, theobromine or theophylline, and synthesis from dimethyl urea and malinic acid. At room temperature, pure caffeine is odorless and bitter, in the form of a white powder or long, flexible crystals. Physical and chemical properties of caffeine. Methylxanthines. A. Organoleptic properties. Caffeine, as an example methylxanthine, is a colorless powder at room temperature. It is odorless but does have a slightly bitter taste. B. Melting and sublimation temperatures. The trimethylated xanthine, caffeine, sublimes at 1800 degrees Celsius, which is a lower temperature of sublimation than theobromine. C. Solution formation. Solubility values are distinctive for caffeine, theobromine, and theophylline. Caffeine dissolves well in boiling water, but at room temperature chloroform is one of the best solvents. Theobromine is generally much less soluble than caffeine, but it will dissolve readily in aqueous acids and alkalis. Theophylline is intermediate between caffeine and theobromine in its ability to form solutions. D. Ultraviolet and infrared absorption. The methylxanthines show useful strong ultraviolet, UV, Absorption between 250 and 280 nanometers. The spectra for the methylxanthines are very similar, and only when one uses techniques such as derivative spectroscopy can substantial differences be seen. In addition to the UV absorption, the methylxanthines also exhibit strong infrared (IR) spectra, which can provide critical information about these compounds. Complex formation. In aqueous solution, caffeine associates to form at least a dimer and probably a polymer. The molecules are arranged in a stack. Caffeine will also associate with purines and pyrimidines either as the free bases or as their nucleosides. Caffeine crystallizes from water as a monohydrate. Chlorogenic acid forms a 1-to-1 complex with caffeine, which can be crystallized from aqueous alcohol and yields very little free caffeine on extraction with chloroform. Other compounds with which caffeine will complex in this way include isocugenol, coumarin, indoleacetic acid, and anthocyanidin. The basis for this selection was the requirement for a substituted aromatic ring and a conjugated double bond in forming such a complex. This kind of complex does modify the physiological effects of caffeine. Complex formation will also increase the apparent aqueous solubility of caffeine in the presence of alkali benzoates, cinnamates, citrates, and salicylates. A description of the physical properties and behavior of caffeine in its aqueous solution was published in 1980 by Both and Kamenga. Where the complexing agent is phenolic, the pH must be such that the phenol is undissociated. Usually such complexes form at a pH below 6. Free caffeine concentrations are increased above pH 6. The methylxanthines vary in their ability to form certain metal complexes. For example, theophylline will complex with both copper and silver, whereas caffeine will not. The interpretation of this is that the metal ion forms a pentacyclic complex involving the phenolic 0 at C6 and N at 7. Acidic and basic equilibria. Caffeine behaves as a very feeble base and reacts with acids. The salts produced are very readily hydrolyzed. Evidence for the formation of protonated caffeine can be seen in the changed UV spectrum for caffeine at pH 0. Theobromine and theophylline are weakly amphoteric and behave more distinctly as acids or bases than caffeine does. This is evident from the ease with which theobromine and theophylline will dissolve in aqueous acids and bases. They are only sparingly soluble in pure water. Sources and trends of caffeine consumption. Caffeine is a mild central nervous system stimulant. Caffeine occurs naturally in the seeds, leaves or fruits of more than 60 plant species across the world, including coffee arabica, robusta, coffee beans, Camellia sinensis, tea leaves, Theobroma cacao, cacao bean, Paullinia cupana, guarana berries, Cola acuminate, cola nut, and Ilex paraguariensis, yerba mate. Caffeine is a natural pesticide to certain insects, and its bitter taste is a deterrent to herbivores. Coffee beans and tea leaves are the primary dietary source of caffeine, worldwide. The main sources of dietary caffeine for adults are coffee, 80.6%, tea, 12.3%, and soft drinks, 5.9%. Caffeine can be extracted from the naturally occurring sources listed above, and is used as an additive for other foods and beverages. Examples include energy drinks and soft drinks, as well as bottled water, chewing gum, mints and candy, foods often consumed by children and adolescents. Caffeine serves as an analgesic adjuvant when added to pain relief medication, and can be added to dietary supplements due to its appetite suppressant effects and because it may stimulate energy expenditure. Caffeine use exceeds that of alcohol and nicotine, prompting many to call it the world's most commonly used psychoactive drug. More than 80% of the world's population regularly consumes a caffeinated product. Average caffeine intake has been estimated to be 70 to 76 milligrams per day, or less than 1 cup of coffee, containing about 100 milligrams of caffeine. The predominance of caffeine use is related to its widespread availability, social acceptance, reinforcing beneficial effects such as increased alertness, and the avoidance of withdrawal symptoms. However, caffeine's reinforcing effects are biphasic. At doses exceeding 10 mg per kilogram, the effects are aversive and usually associated with dysphoric or toxic effects. As a result, Most individuals who regularly consume caffeine adjust their intake to achieve plasma caffeine levels that maximize the desired effects, while avoiding the unpleasant ones. Caffeine content can vary widely within the different types of caffeinated products, with coffee and energy drinks containing the most caffeine, while chocolate or cocoa products contain the least. The caffeine content of coffee and tea depends on factors including plant variety, growing conditions, treatment, processing, storage and method of preparation. Tea leaves have more caffeine than coffee beans on a weight basis, but the method of preparation results in up to 1/3 less caffeine in tea per cup. Caffeine content of coffee can also vary by brand and purchase location. The primary sources of dietary caffeine vary between populations by culture, geographic region and age group. For North America and many European countries, coffee is the main source of caffeine, whereas tea is the primary source in the United Kingdom and in Asian countries. The quantity of caffeine regularly consumed also varies between populations. Adults have the highest average caffeine intake, consuming more than 300 mg per day. Caffeine intake can also be influenced by concern for the safety of consumers. For healthy adults, it is advisable limit daily caffeine intake to 400 mg, equivalent to 4 8-ounce cups of coffee. Differences in habitual consumption occur by age group, with adults consuming approximately 4 mg per kilogram, compared to 1.1 mg per kilogram for children and adolescents. In addition, adults tend to consume caffeine through coffee or tea sources, while adolescents consume it through soft drinks, energy drinks and coffee-type drinks. In addition to the population-based factors listed above, various individual reasons can influence habitual consumption. Personal factors such as lifestyle, personality, health conditions and caffeine tolerance shape an individual's choice to consume caffeine. Absorption and distribution. Caffeine is almost completely absorbed from the stomach and small intestine into the bloodstream approximately 45 minutes following oral ingestion and reaches peak plasma concentration in less than 120 minutes. Caffeine doses of 5 to 8 mg per kilogram yield peak plasma concentrations of 8 to 10 mg per liter. Consumption of 1 cup of coffee provides a dose of 0.4 to 0.25 mg per kilogram, which leads to a peak concentration of 0.25 to 2 mg per liter, or 1 to 10 Caffeine is a lipophilic molecule, and, upon absorption, it passes freely through plasma membranes, resulting in virtually equal distribution through body tissues, including blood, saliva, breast milk and semen. For this reason, caffeine concentration in serum can be ascertained through a non-invasive saliva sample. Caffeine passes readily through the placenta, and high caffeine levels have been reported in premature infants born to mothers with high caffeine intake. Caffeine crosses the blood-brain barrier via diffusion as well as saturable carrier-mediated transport. Its unrestricted uptake into the brain may account for the rapid onset of psychological symptoms following caffeine consumption. Metabolism and excretion. Caffeine metabolism occurs in the liver. Metabolism of low doses of caffeine, 70 to 100 mg, exhibits linear pharmacokinetics, while higher doses, 250 to 500 mg, result in nonlinear rates, evidenced by prolonged rates of clearance. Cytochrome P451A2, CYP1A2, is responsible for 95% of caffeine metabolism. Caffeine elimination half-life ranges from 2 to 12 hours, averaging 4 to 6 hours in adult humans. Overnight caffeine abstinence, 10 to 14 hours, is generally sufficient for caffeine elimination in most individuals. However, there have been individuals with large amounts of caffeine detected after 24 hours of abstinence. The variability in the rate of caffeine elimination may be due, in part, to differences in caffeine dosage, as the metabolic enzymes are saturable at doses exceeding 10 mg per kilogram. CYP1A2 inducibility is affected by several factors, including CYP1A2-163, a greater than C genotype, age, sex, oral contraceptive use, pregnancy, smoking status, long-term alcohol use and liver disease. For example, caffeine metabolism in females is 20 to 30% faster than in males. Among females taking oral contraceptives, the half-life of caffeine is double that of females who do not use them. Pregnancy increases the half-life of caffeine from 4 hours in the first trimester up to 15 hours during the third trimester. Infants have increased caffeine half-life due to lower activity of cytochrome P450 and immaturity of some demethylation and acetylation pathways. In full-term newborns, caffeine half-life is approximately 80 hours, while it can be greater than 100 hours in premature newborns. After 6 months of age, caffeine half-life is almost equivalent to that of an adult. Caffeine half-life is reduced 30 to 50% in smokers, while long-term alcohol consumption and chronic liver disease increase its half-life. Approximately a dozen of caffeine's metabolites are excreted and detected in urine. The major excreted metabolites include 3-methyluracil, 1-methyluracil, 1,7-dimethyluric acid and paraxanthine, 1,7-dimethylxanthine. Only 1 to 2% of caffeine is excreted unmetabolized. Potential sites of action. Major mechanisms must be considered with respect to the actions of caffeine on the peripheral and central nervous system. Blockade of adenosine receptors, in particular AL and A2A adenosine receptors. Caffeine's effects are biphasic. The stimulatory behavioral effects in humans and rodents become manifest with plasma levels of 5 to 20 whereas higher doses are depressant. The only sites of action where caffeine would be expected to have a major pharmacological effect at levels of 5 to 20 are the AL and the A2A adenosine receptors, where caffeine is a competitive antagonist. Convulsions and death can occur at levels above 300 However, it cannot be excluded that subtle effects of 5 to 20 caffeine at sites of action other than adenosine receptors might have some relevance to both acute and chronic effects of caffeine. The role of adenosine in the central nervous system. Caffeine interacts with the adenosine receptor system. Adenosine is an essential component of cellular metabolism and is constantly being formed intra and extracellularly. The concentration of free adenosine increases with cellular energy usage. Unlike typical neurotransmitters, adenosine is not contained in synaptic vesicles nor released by vesicular exocytosis. Instead, adenosine flows in and out of the cell via equilibrative transporters and is therefore known as neuromodulator. Adenosine receptors are G-protein coupled receptors, and there are 4 known receptors, A1, A2A, A2B, and A3, found throughout the body. In the central nervous system, the AL receptors are widely distributed in the cortex, cerebellum, thalamus, and hippocampus both pre- and postsynaptically. At AL receptors, adenosine inhibits adenyl cyclase, activates K+ and inactivates KAT+ channels, thereby hyperpolarizing the neuron and reducing its firing rate. Conversely, the neural A2 receptors are found primarily in the striatum, and adenosine binding produces a stimulant effect by increasing adenosine 3,5-cyclic monophosphate, CAMP. The striatum, consisting of the caudate nucleus, putamen, nucleus accumbens, and olfactory tubercle, plays an integral role in motor planning, reward seeking, and learning. Here, the AL and the A2A receptors are co-localized with dopamine D1 and D2 receptors, respectively, on GABAergic neurons where adenosine antagonizes, or blocks, dopamine binding. This decreases locomotor activity. Adenosine may also be an endogenous sleep factor and mediate sleepiness following sleep deprivation. Concentrations of adenosine are greater during the wake cycle than the sleep cycle, and concentrations increase with prolonged wakefulness. The sleep-promoting effects of adenosine in the cholinergic basal forebrain are believed to be mediated by AL_receptors, although A2A receptors have also been implicated in the ventrolateral preoptic area. In addition, A2 receptors are also located on cerebrovascular smooth muscle where adenosine causes vasodilation primarily via A2A receptors. The A2B receptor is found in low levels throughout the brain and on blood vessels, but is thought to only be activated by pathologically high concentrations of adenosine. The role and location of A3 receptors are not well understood. A hypothetical role for adenosine in the central nervous system is to decrease neuronal firing during an ischemic event to prevent excitotoxicity, as well as to increase local cerebral blood flow, CBF, to improve oxygen delivery and help eliminate toxic byproducts. The effects of caffeine in the central nervous system. The binding affinity for caffeine is 12 to L receptors and 2.41 m to A2A receptors. Caffeine is a neurostimulant, and indirectly facilitates neural activity by increasing energy metabolism, increasing excitatory postsynaptic potentials, and by decreasing resting membrane potentials. Both acute and chronic caffeine administration increase plasma adenosine concentrations, and adenosine concentrations are lower than normal following withdrawal from chronic caffeine administration. This could affect caffeine binding differently in a withdrawn state compared to a normal caffeinated state. For instance, during withdrawal, caffeine concentrations could outweigh adenosine concentrations, resulting in more caffeine binding and a large stimulant effect. Whereas in the normal caffeinated state, the increased adenosine concentrations produce more competition with caffeine for receptor binding, therefore the stimulant effects of caffeine could be diminished by repeated dosing. Caffeine also modulates D2 receptor-mediated GABA release in the globus pallidus and increases levels of dopamine in the striatum. This mechanism of action has been implicated in the locomotor stimulating effects of caffeine. Although it increases extracellular dopamine, caffeine is a modest reinforcer and is not considered to have addiction liability. Other neural effects of caffeine include the release of intracellular Ca++ via ryanodine receptors and the inhibition of cyclic nucleotide phosphodiesterases, although these effects occur at millimolar concentrations, which are much greater than concentrations reached by human caffeine consumption. In addition to its neural effects, caffeine is a potent vasoconstrictor. By antagonizing the A2A receptors located on the vascular smooth muscle, caffeine reduces CBF. A 250 mg dose can reduce global CBF by 20 to 30%. Effects of caffeine on sleep and wakefulness. It is a daily observation that in public transport, at home in the evening, and at times when people are expected to be fully awake, they suffer from a continuous sleep deprivation and too low a level of wakefulness. Data from laboratory studies show that a shortage of nocturnal sleep by as little as 1.3 to 1.5 hours for one night results in a 1/3 reduction of daytime objective alertness. Also, 17 to 57% of healthy young adults have sleep onset latencies, SOL, during daytime of less than 5.5 minutes, plus 50% of the normal SOL, and that about 28% of young adults as a rule sleep less than 6.5 each night of the week. In general, there exists a significant sleep loss in at least 1/3 of all adults. For this reason, it is not amazing that fatigue is a factor in 57% of traffic accidents, resulting in many casualties. It is no surprise that people look for ways to compensate for a shortage of sleep and to stay awake when necessary. Caffeine-containing beverages such as coffee might be of help. Unfortunately, most studies, especially those conducted before the 1990s, have been focused on disturbing sleep and wakefulness by giving caffeine shortly before sleep. Hence, the conclusion: caffeine induced a restless sleep, predominantly in the first half of the sleep. Effects of caffeine on sleepiness were assessed mainly by measuring sleep latency, mood, and task performance. With doses of caffeine up to 400 mg, sleep latency increased and task performance improved on easy tasks but tended to be impaired on complex tasks. More recent studies also adhere to the tradition of giving caffeine shortly before going to sleep or even administer caffeine, 5 mg/kg, intravenously during sleep. Such studies make it difficult to appraise the influence of coffee on sleep and wakefulness in everyday life. The general conclusion was that caffeine, corrected for the influence of age, gender, personality, and consumption habits, modulates arousal level and that, depending on this interaction, divergent and even contradictory effects on sleep and waking have been found. Herein an attempt is made to emphasize in particular the effects of caffeine on sleep and wakefulness. Sleep. About 1/3 of our lives is spent in sleeping, but the reason we sleep is still unknown. Mostly, sleep is described as a part of the 24-hour endogenous arousal cycle with its peak in the afternoon, post-lunch dip of arousal, and its trough around 3 a.m. and a low shortly after noon. The behavioral manifestation of the circadian arousal cycle, which has to do with the underlying endogenous variations of adenosine and its metabolites, is expressed as sleep and wakefulness. The best-known adenosine receptor antagonist, caffeine, and adenosine form an important subject in sleep research. Adenosine can be seen as a sleep-inducing factor. Its concentration is higher during wakefulness than during sleep. It accumulates in the brain during prolonged wakefulness, and local perfusions as well as systemic administration of adenosine and its agonists induce sleep and decrease wakefulness. Adenosine receptor antagonists, caffeine and theophylline, are widely used as stimulants of the central nervous system to induce vigilance and increase the time spent awake. Caffeine is an antidote of sleep or an antihypnotic. Caffeine was efficacious in overcoming sleep inertia by its occupation of adenosine receptors in the brain. Recording brain activity with an electroencephalogram, EEG, is useful to follow the periodic fluctuations and arousal that are characteristic of sleep. The recorded sleep structure is used to describe the quality and depth of sleep, ranging from stage 1 through stage 4 to the rapid eye movement, REM, stage. Stages 1 and 2 together form light sleep. Stage 2 is the transition from the period of falling asleep to deep sleep and is used as an objective criterion to measure sleepiness. Stages 3 and 4 together represent deep sleep or slow wave sleep, SWS. Stages 1 to 4 are called non-REM sleep, NREM sleep. When stage 4 is reached, there is a quick return via stages 3, 2, and 1 to a state in which REM sleep occurs. Physiological characteristics of REM sleep, contrary to NREM sleep, are an irregular heart and respiration rate, absent muscle tones of the extremities, a higher threshold to awaken, and the relatively easy reporting of detailed dreams. In the first half of the night more NREM sleep, especially more SWS, is found. In the second half increasingly more REM sleep and light sleep are found. The period needed to change from NREM to REM is called a sleep cycle. Although sleep as a biological rhythm is determined largely by endogenous physiological factors with a free-running length of about 25 hours, exogenous factors, so-called Zeitgebers, overrule this free-running 25-hour period and force it to a 24-hour sleep-wake rhythm. Important Zeitgebers are the succession of light and dark and social factors such as the scheduling of work and leisure activities. Disturbing these Zeitgebers by responding to the demands of the 24-hour economy can only have serious consequences for sleep and wakefulness.